Everyone, today we're going to be doing LeetCode number 78, which is subsets. The problem description says, given an integer array nums of unique elements, return all possible subsets, the power set. The solution set must not contain duplicate subsets. Return the solution in any order. So if we look at example 1, we're given an array 1, 2, 3, and all the possible subsets are these right here, starting off with an empty list. Okay, so what we're gonna do is I'm just gonna illustrate the process of our algorithm that we're gonna build to better visualize the problem and understand what's going on. So I'm just gonna bring up Paint here, just illustrate the problem. Okay, so for this problem, what we're gonna be using, the technique we're gonna be using is recursion. We're gonna use recursion and backtracking. And I'll show a little bit more of why we're gonna use it and how we're gonna use this to solve the problem. So what we're gonna wanna do is we're gonna wanna loop through every single index, okay? So the very first thing is I'm just gonna draw my result right here, just my result right here, which is currently empty, there's nothing. And the result is a list of lists. So what we have to do is create all lists and add them to this list result. Okay. So for this example, my I is going to be on the left side. Okay. So for the very first call, when we start the for loop is going to start at index 0. Okay. The very first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add. So before all of this starts, we're going to have a current list that we're going to pass in. It's going to use us to basically use this current list and fill up the result with these lists of currents. Okay, so the very first thing is we're going to want to add the current list. So I'm just going to add current, which is currently empty. So our result would be empty. Okay, now the next thing we're going to want to do is okay, for this we're going to add a copy. We're going to add a copy of it because we are passing by reference. So anything that we do to this list is going to be it's going to affect the list. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a copy of our current. So our current is empty, so we add it. Okay, now what we're going to want to do is we're going to add the current number, that index. Okay, so we are at index 0, so we're going to add the 1. Okay, now what we're going to do now is we're going to do a recursive call for the next index. So if our index is 0, we're going to do an index plus 1. Okay, so now trace, we're going to have this new call for index 1. And the same step, we're going to want to add a copy of the current, okay, to our result list. So this is our list. We just have one element, so we're just going to add a copy of it. Okay. Now we're going to add the current number at that specific index. So for on index 1, we're going to have the number 2. Okay. So now we have 1, 2. Okay. Now the same thing, we're going to use recursion and call for the next index plus 1. So plus 1 would be index 2. Okay. So the same thing, we're going to add a copy. I'm just going to put AZ. And we have 1, 2 from the current one that we have. Okay. Now if we have 1, 2 in the copy, 1, 2, what we're going to want to do is, since we are on index 2, we are going to add that number to our list. So now we're going to have 1, 2, 3. Okay. 1, 2, 3. So now we're going to do a recursive call and call index 3. Okay. Now index 3, the very first thing is going to add the copy. So we're going to have 1, 2, 3. Okay. Now the same thing. We're going to, after adding the copy, our index is 3, which is going to be out of bounds. So it's not going to go into the for loop. So nothing's going to be done. So this call is done. Okay. Now we go back. Okay. Now at index 2, what we want to do is we're going to backtrack and delete the last number. Okay. Let's delete the last number. Okay. And since we're in a for loop, we're going to increment our I. So now our I was 2. So plus plus, so it's gonna be 3. I is 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. It's longer than the length of our nums, so nothing's gonna happen. So we're done with that call stack. Okay. Now, once we get back here, the same thing, we're gonna backtrack and delete the 2 and increment our I since it's in a for loop. So now this is gonna be 2. Okay. So the same thing in the for loop, what we're doing is we're gonna add the number at our index. So if it's at index 2, 0, 1, 2, my number's right here. So we're gonna add the 3. Okay. Now the same thing, recursion, we're gonna do a recursive call and we're gonna call index plus 1. So this will be index 3. The very first step we had to do is add the copy, copy of current to our list. So now we have 1, 3. We have 1, 3. Okay. And 3 is greater than the length of our numbers. So it's not going to enter the for loop. So we are done with this call stack. Okay. Now the same thing, we're going to backtrack and delete the last number. Okay. And we are going to increment our I. So 2. So now this is going to be 3. 3 is greater than the length of our numbers. So we are done with this call stack. Okay. So now what we're going to do is go back to this call stack and again backtrack and delete the number at the end of our list, which is just 1. And we're going to increment our I. So we're going to increment I from 0 to 1. Now we're going to add the number at our index 1, which is 2. Okay. So we add the 2. Now we're going to do the recursive call. And I plus 1 is 2. So the very first thing that we're going to want to do is again add the current copy. So if this was just, so we're just going to have 2. Okay. Now if we have 2, we're going to add the number at index 2. So the number at index 2 is right here. So that's the number 3. 3. We add it to our list. We do our recursive call. 3. The very first thing is we're going to add the copy. So we're just going to add 2, 3. Okay, so once we added the 2, 3, the very first thing, we see that the index is 3, which is longer than the length of our array. So nothing's going to happen. It's not going to go into the for loop. So we're done with that call. Now, once we go back, again, we're going to backtrack and delete the last number and increment our I. So now our I is going to go to 3. Okay. You can see that 3 is greater than the length of our numbers. So nothing's going to happen. We're done with that call. Okay. Now we're going to delete the last element of the list, which is just 2. Delete it. And we're going to increment our I to 2 and 2. Okay. So now we're going to add the number at index 2, which is just 3. Again, we're going to do a recursive call, I plus 1, so which is 3. Very first thing we're going to want to do is add the copy, add the copy of our current list, which is just has 3. So once we add the copy, this will be 3. Okay. Now the next thing is this is not going to go into the for loop since 3 is greater than our length. So we're done with this call. Again, we're going to delete the last element and increment our I. Our I is 3. And we could see that 3 is greater than the length numbers. So the condition is met. So we are done. So that's the process of filling up the result list. And if we compare, we could see that we filled it up. So we have empty. We have 1, 1, 2. We have 2. We have 3. We have all the correct subsets. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually create the code. We're going to start coding. The very first thing is we're going to create a list of lists, which is integer. And Let's call this result. New array list. Okay. So now what we're going to want to do is create a helper function. So it's going to be a void function since it's just going to help us fill the subsets. So we can call it fill subsets. Fill subsets. And it is going to take our numbers. It is going to take the current index that we're on. So the index and the list that we're filling up. And the current list, like we said during the explanation, just also type integer. Let's call this current. Okay. So now what we're going to want to do right here, we're just going to want to call the fill subsets. Fill subsets. We're going to pass in our numbers. The index that we're starting off, it's index 0. So we're going to pass in a 0 for the index. We're going to pass in the results. And we're just going to send an empty list to start off with. Okay. Now the very first step that we said is we're going to add a copy of our current list. So we're going to do current.add new array list. And it's a copy of our current. Okay. So now we're just going to iterate through. And I is equal to, we're starting off at index. So if our index is 0, it's going to start off at 0. So our I is going to be less than our length of our numbers. So like we said, we're going to, after we add a copy of our current, we're going to add to our current the number that we're on. So we're just going to do current dot add. Originally current dot add nums of I. Sorry, this is not current. This is result. Result.add. Okay. So now our current, we're going to add the current number that we're on. To do that, we're going to do a recursive call to our function, fill subsets, same parameters, nums. We did say we want to get the next element. So if we're on 0, we're going to do a recursive call on 0 plus 1. So that would be I plus 1. So in this case, it is I plus 1. We're going to send our result. We're going to send our current. Okay, so that's going to keep going. And once we reach the case where we have to go back, once the, let's say our case when the index was greater than, we have to go back and backtrack and delete the last number. So we're going to do current dot remove current dot size minus 1. Okay. Now doing that, this is going to iterate and find all the possible subsets for our numbers. So once we do that, we could just return our results, since this should be filled with all our subsets. So let me just run the code and make sure I don't have any syntax errors. Okay, I just submit it. Great, you can see that it works.